Eat it. Now. Show some respect for the rules, or this won't end well for you. The officer's voice was cold, dripping with a sense of authority and disdain. His boots scraped against the pavement as he nudged a pile of discarded food wrappers closer to the elderly woman. She hesitated, her trembling hands clutching the edge of a small cloth bag filled with scraps she had gathered from the local market. Her silence enraged him further. "What? You think you're better than this? Better than me?" His voice rose, drawing the attention of a few onlookers nearby. Yet none dared to intervene. Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." But her quiet plea only fueled his cruelty. He smirked, taking a step closer. "Wrong. You don't belong here, lady. You think you can just walk through this neighborhood, dirtying up the place. Pick it up. Eat it. Show everyone here how trash deals with trash." She froze, every fiber of her being screamed to stand up for herself, but she couldn't. The weight of years of subtle insults, condescending looks, and outright hatred pressed down on her. She had endured so much, and here she was, facing another act of indignity, only this time it was meant to break her completely. A man in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't right," he murmured under his breath. But as the officer shot a glare in his direction, he quickly lowered his head and walked away. Others followed, averting their eyes, afraid to become the next target. The woman dropped to her knees, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Please, I have a family, a son. He works hard to make this world better. Don't do this." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officer leaned closer, his badge glinting under the streetlight, his smirk unwavering. "If you don't like it, you can take it up with the law." "Oh, wait, that's me." She reached for the discarded food, her hands shaking with humiliation and rage. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. She wasn't just being degraded. She was being erased, treated as if her very existence was an offense. The sound of tires screeching cut through the air. A sleek car pulled up to the curb, its door swinging open with urgency. A tall figure stepped out, moving with purpose and authority. The officer barely had time to register what was happening before a voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the tension. "Get away from her. Now." The officer turned, his smug expression faltering for the first time as he took in the sight of the newcomer. There was something about the way this man carried himself, calm, calculated, but undeniably powerful. The officer straightened his posture, his hand instinctively resting on the baton at his hip. "And who the hell are you?" the officer demanded, his tone laced with annoyance, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The man ignored the question, his attention fully on the woman kneeling on the ground. His face hardened as he saw the tears streaming down her cheeks, the defeated slump of her shoulders. He knelt beside her, his voice softening as he spoke. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, but her silence spoke volumes. Her trembling fingers clung to his arm as if he were her last lifeline. The officer chuckled, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, pal, this doesn't concern you. Just move along and we'll forget this ever happened." But the man's eyes, sharp as daggers, locked onto the officer. "Forget," he repeated, his voice low and deadly. "You think you can humiliate her, degrade her, and walk away without consequences." A crowd began to gather again, drawn by the tension that hung thick in the air. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who was this man? Why did the officer suddenly seem nervous? "Listen, buddy," the officer stammered, his bravado slipping. "You don't know what she's done." Enough, the man interrupted, his voice cutting through the officer's excuses like a blade. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, tapping the screen with precision. Within seconds, a recording of the entire incident played out, the officer's words echoing back at him like a damning confession. The crowd gasped, their murmurs growing louder. Some pulled out their own phones, capturing the scene unfolding before them. The officer's face paled as he realized the magnitude of the situation. His hand instinctively reached for the phone, but the man stepped back, his expression unyielding. You wanted to humiliate her. You wanted to humiliate her. You wanted to show your power. The man's voice rose, each word striking like a hammer. Let's see how powerful you feel when this goes viral. When your badge doesn't protect you anymore. When the entire country sees you for what you are. The officer stumbled backward, his bravado completely shattered. I was just doing my job, he muttered weakly, but even he didn't believe his own words. The man's gaze never wavered. Your job is to protect and serve, not to abuse and degrade. And trust me, this is far from over. The crowd erupted. Their voices a mix of outrage and support. The officer tried to push his way through, but the man blocked his path, his towering presence impossible to ignore. You think you're untouchable. The man blocked his path, his towering presence impossible to ignore. You think you're untouchable, the man said, his voice calm, but filled with unshakable resolve. But tonight, you'll learn what accountability feels like. And just like that, the tides turned. The officer, once so smug and sure of his authority, now found himself surrounded by a sea of angry faces. The officer, once so smug and sure of his authority, now found himself surrounded by a sea of angry faces, his every move scrutinized. The man knelt beside the woman once more, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. I've got this, he whispered, his tone soft but resolute. You don't have to be afraid anymore. The woman nodded, her tears replaced by a flicker of hope. For the first time that night, she felt like she wasn't alone. But this was only the beginning. What would happen next would shake the very foundation of everything the officer believed he could get away with. And as the crowd grew larger, their phones capturing every second, one thing became clear: justice was coming, and it would be unforgettable. Would the officer face the consequences of his actions? Would the man's relentless pursuit of justice expose deeper corruption? Or would the system protect its own? Stay with us to find out. This story is far from over. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and any form of discrimination. To every Black viewer watching this, know that we see you, we support you, and we are committed to amplifying stories that challenge injustice and promote equity. Your strength, resilience, and voice matter profoundly. We hope this story inspires and moves you. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives. Thank you for being here. Now, enjoy the story. The neighborhood bustled with the kind of life that could only be found on a Saturday morning at the local farmer's market. Stalls overflowed with fresh produce, the air filled with the mingling aromas of ripe fruits, baked goods, and freshly brewed coffee. Families wandered between the rows of vendors, children tugging on their parents' hands, voices overlapping in the hum of casual conversations. Amid the crowd, Mary Thompson moved with quiet determination. In her late 60s, she carried herself with a grace that defied her modest means. Mary wasn't here to browse like most others. Her purpose was more practical. Clutching a well-worn canvas bag, she methodically picked up discarded produce left behind by careless hands or tossed aside by vendors who deemed it unsellable. It wasn't pride that drove her, but necessity. Mary's life had never been easy. Born in the Deep South during the tail end of segregation, she grew up in a world where opportunities were few and prejudices many. Yet, she had weathered every storm, raising her son, Daniel, on her own after her husband passed unexpectedly. Mary cleaned houses, cooked meals, and worked tirelessly to give Daniel the education she never had. Her sacrifices bore fruit. Daniel grew into a man she could only describe as her greatest accomplishment. Now a prominent civil rights attorney in a nearby city, he fought for justice with the same passion that Mary had poured into raising him. But the echoes of a difficult past never truly disappeared. Mary lived frugally, her days spent in service to others. She found dignity in the small acts of kindness she extended to her community, delivering home-cooked meals to sick neighbors or sharing stories with children at the community center. To most, she was a quiet yet steadfast presence, a symbol of perseverance. The market was winding down when it happened. Mary had just bent down to retrieve a slightly bruised apple near a vendor's stall when she heard the sharp voice behind her. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Turning slowly, Mary found herself face to face with Officer Brian Carter, mid-30s, tall. With a buzz cut and a perpetual smirk, Brian exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wasn't from this part of town. His patrol route rarely brought him here, but when it did, he made sure everyone knew who was in charge. To him, neighborhoods like this were a nuisance, filled with people who, in his eyes, didn't deserve the same respect as those from wealthier parts of the city. "I'm talking to you, lady." Brian's tone was sharp, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "Stealing, are we?" Mary straightened, clutching her bag tightly. "No, sir," she said calmly. "I'm just picking up what's been left behind." Brian snorted, glancing at the bag in her hand. "Left behind? That's what they all say. You think just because you look harmless, you can do whatever you want." Mary opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. A small crowd had started to gather, their faces a mix of concern and apprehension. The tension in the air was palpable. Brian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You people are always the same, always taking what doesn't belong to you. Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson." Mary's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Brian's smirk widened, his eyes narrowing. "Wrong? I'll show you wrong." He glanced around, his gaze landing on a nearby trash can overflowing with discarded wrappers and spoiled food. Without a word, he tipped it over, the contents spilling onto the pavement. The onlookers gasped, a few stepping back in shock. "Go on," Brian said, gesturing to the mess. "Pick it up. Let everyone see what happens when you steal from this neighborhood." Mary stared at him, her hands trembling. "Please," she whispered. "I haven't done anything to deserve this." But Brian was unmoved. "I said pick it up." The crowd remained silent, their discomfort evident, but their fear of confrontation stronger. Mary hesitated, torn between standing her ground and avoiding further humiliation. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, shame. In that moment, the roar of an engine pierced the heavy silence. A black luxury car pulled up to the curb, its sleek exterior gleaming under the mid-morning sun. The door opened and out stepped Daniel, his tall frame and tailored suit cutting an imposing figure. Mary's eyes widened in disbelief. "Daniel," she whispered, the relief in her voice unmistakable. Daniel's gaze swept the scene, taking in his mother's trembling figure, the overturned trash, and the smug expression on Brian's face. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "What the hell is going on here?" Daniel demanded, his voice firm and commanding. Brian turned his smirk, faltering as he registered Daniel's presence. "This is none of your business," he said, though the confidence in his tone had waned. Daniel's eyes locked onto Brian, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. "That's my mother," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "And you're going to explain to me, right now, why you think you can treat her like this." The crowd, emboldened by Daniel's arrival, began murmuring among themselves. A few raised their phones, recording the confrontation. Brian shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the situation starting to sink in. Mary reached for Daniel's hand, her voice breaking as she said, "It's okay, Daniel. Let's just go." But Daniel shook his head. "No, Mom," he said, his voice softening as he turned to her. "This isn't okay. Not anymore." The moment hung heavy in the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel straightened, his gaze never leaving Brian's. "You've made a mistake," Daniel said, his tone calm but filled with an unyielding resolve. And now, you're going to pay for it. As the crowd leaned in, anticipation crackling through the air like static, one thing was clear. This was far from over. Daniel's grip on his mother's arm was firm but gentle as he guided her toward the bench by the curb. Mary moved silently, her trembling hands betraying the emotional toll of what had just happened. She lowered herself onto the bench, her gaze fixed on the ground as if avoiding the weight of the crowd's stares. Daniel knelt before her, his sharp eyes scanning her face. "Are you hurt, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with an undercurrent of restrained anger. Mary shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "I'm fine," she whispered, but her voice cracked under the pressure of holding back tears. "Just embarrassed." Daniel inhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a moment before rising to his feet. His broad shoulders squared as he turned to face Officer Bryan, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed defensively. The crowd lingered, their murmurs filling the air like static. "What you did," Daniel began, his voice low and controlled, "was not only inhumane, it was illegal." Bryan scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Illegal? Come on, I was just doing my job, cleaning up the streets." Daniel stepped closer, his towering presence forcing Bryan to take a slight step back. "Your job," Daniel said, his voice rising, "is to protect and serve, not humiliate and degrade. What you did was abuse of power. And trust me, I'm going to make sure you're held accountable." Bryan smirked, though it lacked the confidence he'd shown earlier. "Look, buddy, you can shout all you want, but this isn't your courtroom. Out here, I'm the law." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and cutting. "The law. You're a disgrace to that badge you're wearing." Bryan's hand twitched toward his radio, but the crowd's presence stayed his movement. He glanced around, realizing that every second of the interaction was being recorded. Phones were pointed at him from all directions, capturing every word, every gesture. One voice from the crowd broke through the murmurs. "Yeah, you tell him," a woman called, emboldened by Daniel's defiance. Others nodded in agreement, their whispers growing louder. Mary, still seated on the bench, finally lifted her gaze. "Daniel, please," she said softly, her tone heavy with concern. "Don't make it worse." Daniel turned to her, his expression softening. "It's already bad enough, Mom. And this isn't about making it worse. It's about making it right." He faced Bryan again, stepping even closer. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel said, his voice steady and unyielding. "You're going to apologize to my mother, right here, right now. And then you're going to explain yourself to the department, to the community, to anyone else who demands answers. Or I'll make sure you have more to explain in court." Bryan's face turned a deep shade of red. "You think you can intimidate me? I've been on the force for 10 years. I've dealt with worse than you." Daniel tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Worse than me? I'm not the one who should scare you, Officer Carter. It's the truth that should." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective outrage growing. Someone in the back shouted, "We saw everything," while others the crowd murmured in agreement, their collective outrage growing. Someone in the back shouted, "We saw everything," while others nodded, their expressions a mix of anger and resolve. Bryan's jaw clenched as he glanced toward the patrol car parked nearby. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down completely. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. That's not good enough." Daniel snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Say it to her, and mean it." Bryan hesitated, his eyes darting between Daniel and the crowd. Finally, he turned to Mary, his posture stiff and his words clipped. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone devoid of sincerity. "I shouldn't have done that." Mary looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and quiet defiance. "You didn't just humiliate me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "You humiliated yourself." The crowd erupted in murmurs of approval, the power of her words resonating deeply. Brian's face darkened, but before he could respond, Daniel stepped forward again. "This isn't over," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be filing a formal complaint. And believe me, Officer Carter, you're going to regret every second of what you did today." Brian turned abruptly, walking toward his patrol car without another word. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though a few stayed behind, lingering near Mary and Daniel with quiet words of support. As Daniel helped his mother to her feet, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and worry. "You didn't have to do all that," she said softly. "I'm used to people like him." Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight. "You shouldn't have to be, Mom. Not anymore." They began walking toward his car, the tension still heavy in the air. Mary hesitated as they reached the door. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel opened the door for her, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel opened the door for her, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "now we fight, and we don't stop until he's held accountable." But even as they drove away, Daniel's mind raced. There was something about Brian's arrogance, his dismissive attitude, that gnawed at him. This wasn't just a moment of unchecked power. It felt deeper, more calculated. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was part of a larger pattern, one that needed to be exposed. As the city skyline came into view, Daniel glanced at his mother, who sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He reached over, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "We'll get through this, Mom," he said softly. "Together." Mary nodded, though her expression remained somber. "I believe you," she said. "But be careful, Daniel. Men like him don't go down easily." Daniel's eyes narrowed as he focused on the road ahead. He didn't know exactly what lay before him, but one thing was certain: he wasn't backing down. Not this time. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and Daniel was determined to see them turn, no matter what obstacles stood in his way. The conference room was suffocatingly quiet. Daniel sat at the long mahogany table, his posture tense, eyes scanning the rows of grim faces in front of him. Across from him, Officer Brian Carter slouched, his arrogance poorly masking the cracks in his composure. To Brian's left, his attorney leaned in, whispering something hurriedly in his ear. Daniel didn't bother to listen. His focus was on the evidence he had spent the last week gathering and the long-awaited moment of confrontation that was finally at hand. Mary sat beside Daniel, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced with visible discomfort as she glanced at the officials from Internal Affairs seated at the head of the table. Their neutral expressions betrayed nothing, though Daniel had already read their initial findings. This meeting wasn't just about his mother. It was about every person Officer Carter had wronged. Mr. Thompson, one of the investigators, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone, began. "You've submitted additional evidence to supplement your formal complaint against Officer Carter. Before we review it, do you have any further comments?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "I do. What happened to my mother wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of abuse by Officer Carter. Today, I'm here to make sure that pattern ends." Brian's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You talk a big game, counselor," he said, "but all you've got is a sob story and some exaggerated claims. Let's not pretend this is anything more than a family grudge." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he pressed a button on the laptop in front of him. The screen on the wall flickered to life, displaying footage that Daniel had uncovered over the past week. "Let's start with this," Daniel said, his voice icy. The video showed Brian in uniform, aggressively pulling over a young black man for a minor traffic violation. The audio captured Brian's hostile tone, his repeated threats of arrest, and the young man's trembling voice as he tried to explain he'd done nothing wrong. Daniel didn't stop the video until Brian was shown handcuffing the man and searching his car without cause. Brian shifted in his seat, his smirk fading. "That's nothing," he said quickly. "Standard procedure." Daniel didn't respond. He pressed play on the next clip, a body cam recording from another officer, showing Brian shoving a teenage boy against a wall outside a convenience store. The boy's groceries spilled onto the ground as Brian barked accusations of shoplifting, accusations later proven false. "Standard procedure again?" Daniel asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Brian's attorney intervened, raising a hand. "These incidents are irrelevant to the current matter involving Mr. Thompson's mother. We're here to discuss a pattern of behavior," Daniel interrupted, his voice cutting through the room. "A pattern that shows Officer Carter has a history of targeting vulnerable individuals in this community. My mother isn't the first, and if we don't stop him, she won't be the last." Mary shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Daniel and the investigators. "I don't want to cause trouble," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Daniel turned to her, his voice softening. "You're not causing trouble, Mom. You're standing up for yourself and for everyone else he's hurt." The investigator cleared her throat, bringing the focus back to the table. "Officer Carter, do you have any response to these recordings?" Brian opened his mouth to speak, but his attorney grabbed his arm, shaking her head. "We'll reserve comment for now," she said tersely. Daniel wasn't done. "I also have witness scardoments," he continued, sliding a thick stack of papers across the table. "Dozens of people who've come forward since my mother's story went public. Each of them has a story about Officer Carter, stories of intimidation. People who've come forward since my mother's story went public. Each of them has a story about Officer Carter, stories of intimidation, false arrests, even physical assaults." The room was heavy with tension as the investigators flipped through the scardoments. Brian's face reddened, his confidence unraveling. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "These people are just trying to smear my name." Daniel's calm exterior cracked for the first time. He slammed his palm on the table, his voice rising. "You humiliated my mother in front of an entire community. You've terrorized innocent people for years. This isn't a smear, it's accountability." The room fell silent, the weight of Daniel's words pressing down on everyone present. Even Mary, who had been hesitant to push forward, straightened slightly, her eyes reflecting a glimmer of pride. One of the investigators leaned forward, addressing Brian directly. "Officer Carter, based on what we've seen and heard today, it's clear there's a serious issue with your conduct. Before we make our final recommendation, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Brian's bravado faltered. He glanced at his attorney, who nodded curtly, urging him to speak. For a moment it seemed as though he might offer an apology, a shred of remorse. But when he finally spoke, his words dripped with bitterness. "You're all out to get me," he said, his voice low and venomous. "This is a witch hunt, plain and simple." Daniel shook his head, his expression one of disappointment. "No, Officer Carter, this is justice." The lead investigator exchanged a glance with her colleagues before addressing the room. "We'll be concluding this session and reviewing all submitted materials. A decision regarding Officer Carter's future with the department will be made within the next 48 hours. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel turned to his mother, his expression softening. "Let's get you home, Mom." But as they left the room, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Brian's defiance, his refusal to take responsibility, hinted at something deeper. Daniel knew men like him didn't go down quietly, and he was prepared for whatever came next. Still, the question lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy with anticipation. How far would Brian go to protect himself? And just how much was Daniel willing to risk to ensure justice was served? The tension in Daniel's office was palpable as he sat at his desk, staring at the array of documents and videos spread out before him. The flickering light from his desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, amplifying the weight of the moment. Mary sat across from him, her hands resting on her lap, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and worry. "I don't trust them," Mary said quietly, breaking the silence. "Those investigators. They might have good intentions, but men like that, like him, they always seem to find a way to escape consequences." Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "They can't ignore the evidence, Mom. Not this time." Mary's eyes met his, filled. "Not this time." Mary's eyes met his, filled with a quiet determination. "I'm proud of you for fighting this, Daniel. But I know how these things go. The system protects its own." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up, frowning as he saw the unknown number on the screen. He hesitated before answering. Daniel Thompson. The voice on the other end was low, gravelly, and instantly recognizable. It sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "Counselor Thompson," Brian Carter drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're quite the showman, dragging my name through the mud, parading your little crusade for everyone to see." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "This isn't about a show, Officer Carter. It's about justice." Brian laughed, the sound harsh and unnerving. "Justice? Is that what you think this is? You're just like the rest of them, thinking you can take me down because you've got a few recordings and some sob stories. You humiliated my mother," Daniel said, his voice cold. "You've abused your power for years. It's over, Brian." The line went silent for a moment, and when Brian spoke again, his voice was sharper, more menacing. "You don't know what you're messing with, Thompson. Men like me, we don't go down without a fight." Daniel's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Brian replied. "You think you're untouchable, hiding behind your fancy degrees and your righteous speeches. But everyone has a weak spot, counselor. Even you." The line went dead before Daniel could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. Mary watched him closely, her brow furrowed. "Who was that?" she asked, though the fear in her voice suggested she already knew. Daniel set the phone down carefully, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't matter," he said, though his tone betrayed his unease. "What matters is that we stay focused. We're too close to back down now." Mary reached across the desk, placing her hand over his. "Be careful, Daniel. Please. He's dangerous." Daniel nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I will. I promise." But even as he spoke, a sense of foreboding settled over him. Brian's words weren't empty. Daniel knew men like him thrived on intimidation and fear, and he wasn't about to let that stop him. 2 days later, the hearing reconvened. The conference room was even more crowded this time, with community members, journalists, and additional investigators present. The air buzzed with anticipation as Daniel took his seat beside Mary, his briefcase filled with carefully organized documents. Brian sat at the opposite end of the table, his demeanor smug but strained. His attorney whispered furiously in his ear, but he barely acknowledged her, his eyes fixed on Daniel with a cold intensity. The lead investigator began the session with a measured tone. "We've reviewed the evidence presented by Mr. Thompson, as well as Officer Tate's conduct record. Today, we'll be addressing our findings and determining the appropriate course of action." Daniel leaned forward, his focus unyielding. He knew this was the moment he had worked for, the moment to expose Brian for who he truly was. As the investigators outlined their preliminary conclusions, Daniel noticed a shift in Brian's posture. His confidence seemed to waver, his hands fidgeting under the table. But it wasn't fear that Daniel saw. It was calculation. Brian wasn't panicking, he was planning. Finally, Daniel was given the floor. He stood, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "This isn't just about one incident," he began. "It's about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that has gone unchecked for far too long." He played the recordings again, this time pausing to emphasize key moments: Brian's threats, his abuse of authority, the fear in his victims' voices. Daniel recounted the witness scarments, each one painting a damning picture of a man who had weaponized his badge against the very people he was sworn to protect. Mary watched her son with quiet pride, her own fears momentarily overshadowed by his resolve. Daniel's words carried the weight of not just her experience, but the experiences of countless others who had suffered in silence. When Daniel finished, the room was silent. Even the investigators seemed momentarily taken aback by the sheer volume of evidence. But before they could speak, Brian stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is bullshit," he spat, his voice rising. "You think you can destroy my career with a few cherry-picked videos and some sob stories? You don't know anything about what it's like out there, what it takes to do this job." Daniel turned to face him, his expression calm but unyielding. "What it takes to do this job is integrity, Officer Carter. Something you clearly lack." Brian's face twisted in anger. "You're just another self-righteous lawyer, looking to make a name for yourself at my expense. But you don't scare me, Thompson. None of this does." The lead investigator intervened, her voice firm. "Officer Carter, I advise you to sit down and remain silent. This is not the time for outbursts." But Brian didn't sit. Instead, he leaned across the table, his eyes locked on Daniel. "You think you've won. You have no idea what you've started." Daniel didn't flinch. "What I've started is justice. And it's not going to stop until people like you are held accountable." Brian finally sat, his body rigid with barely justice. "And it's not going to stop until people like you are held accountable." Brian finally sat, his body rigid with barely contained rage. The room was thick with tension as the lead investigator announced that the session would adjourn for deliberation. Daniel escorted Mary out, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. As they walked to the car, Mary glanced at him nervously. "Do you think it's over?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet, but it will be." Despite his confidence, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was still to come. Brian's words echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder that justice was never straightforward, and that some battles were won at a cost. The investigators returned to the conference room after nearly an hour, their faces unreadable. Daniel sat at the table with Mary beside him, his hands clasped tightly together. He didn't show it, but the weight had frayed his nerves. Across from him, Brian Carter fidgeted in his seat, a sheen of sweat on his brow betraying his outward bravado. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he waved her off, staring blankly ahead. The lead investigator cleared her throat, the murmurs in the room falling silent. After a thorough review of the evidence presented in Officer Carter's response, "We have reached a conclusion." The room seemed to hold its breath. Mary clutched Daniel's arm, her grip firm but trembling. Daniel sat perfectly still, his gaze locked on the investigator. Officer Tate's actions, as documented in both the footage and witness scarments, are in clear violation of departmental policy and ethical standards. Furthermore, this pattern of behavior constitutes gross misconduct and abuse of power. There was a collective exhale from the crowd. Daniel felt a surge of relief, but he didn't let it show. This wasn't a victory yet. He knew that justice wasn't just about words. It was about action. The investigator continued. "Effective immediately, Officer Carter is suspended without pay, pending further legal review. Additionally, we will be forwarding our findings to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the decision, but his eyes shifted to Brian. The officer sat rigid, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Daniel knew this wasn't over. Mary leaned toward Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a step in the right direction." Daniel glanced at her, his expression softening. "It's a start," he said, "but there's still more to do." As the session concluded, Brian stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. His attorney tried to stop him, but he shrugged her off. He walked toward Daniel, his movements deliberate, his jaw clenched. "You think this is justice?" Brian spat, his voice low enough that only Daniel and Mary could hear. "You're just another fool trying to take me down. But you're not ready for what's coming." Daniel didn't rise to the bait. He met Brian's glare with calm resolve. "The only thing coming, Officer Carter, is the accountability you've been avoiding your entire career." Brian let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he walked away. His attorney trailed after him, whispering furiously. Daniel watched him go, a knot tightening in his stomach. Mary touched his arm gently. "Let it go for now," she said. "He's lost his badge. That's more than most people ever get." But Daniel knew better. Men like Brian didn't just disappear. They fought back, often with more desperation than ever. He had seen it before, and he wasn't about to let his guard down. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his office, reviewing the day's events. The decision had been a victory, but it felt incomplete. Brian's parting words lingered in his mind, a shadow he couldn't shake. Daniel's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was an unknown number again. Daniel Thompson. There was silence on the other end, followed by a muffled voice. "Mr. Thompson, this is Detective Alex with the local precinct. I think we need to talk." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What's this about?" "It's about Officer Carter," the detective said, his tone cautious. "And some irregularities we've uncovered." Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Go on." "It appears that Officer Tate has been connected to several cases that have raised red flags, missing evidence, questionable arrests, even coercion of witnesses. We've been investigating quietly, but after today's hearing, we thought it was important to bring you in." Daniel's mind raced. "This was bigger than I should warn you, though. Carter's not someone who goes down without a fight. Be careful." Daniel ended up in the hospital. He was in a coma for a week. 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 He was in a down without a fight. Be careful. Daniel ended the call, his thoughts swirling. Brian's actions had clearly been part of a much larger web of corruption. The hearing might have stripped him of his badge, but it hadn't dismantled the system that enabled him. Daniel knew he was on the edge of something monumental and dangerous. The next morning, Daniel met with Detective Alex in a nondescript office at the precinct. Alex, a wiry man in his late 40s with sharp eyes, wasted no time getting to the point. He slid a thick folder across the table. "These are some of the cases we've been looking into," Alex said, "all connected to Carter in some way. There's a clear pattern of misconduct, fabricated charges, excessive force, even evidence tampering." Daniel opened the folder, his stomach sinking as he skimmed the documents. Each case told a story of someone whose life had been upended by Brian's actions. It wasn't just about power. It was about control, manipulation, and a complete disregard for the people he was supposed to serve. "This is damning," Daniel said, his voice low. "Why hasn't this come to light before?" Alex leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Because Carter's friends in high places. Every time someone tried to blow the whistle, it got buried. But now, with your case and the public attention, we might have a chance to break it open." Daniel nodded, determination hardening his features. "What do you need from me?" "Your cooperation," Alex said, "and your willingness to go after the bigger players. Carter's just the tip of the iceberg." Darren sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of his mother, of the humiliation she had endured, and of the countless others who had suffered under Brian's abuse. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. "I'm in," Daniel said finally. "Let's do this." Alex nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Good, but be prepared it's going to get messy." As Daniel left the precinct, his phone buzzed with another unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Daniel Thompson, counselor. The voice on the other end said, low and chillingly familiar, You think you've won, don't you? Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Brian, you've made a lot of enemies, Thompson, Brian continued, his tone dripping with malice. But don't worry, I'll see you again soon. The line went dead, leaving Daniel standing in the middle of the sidewalk, his mind racing. Brian was more dangerous than ever, and Daniel knew the fight was far from over. But he also knew one thing for certain: he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The ride home from the precinct was tense. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set as he replayed the conversation with Detective Alex in his mind. Brian's influence extended deeper than he'd imagined, and the implications of it were as infuriating as they were dangerous. Beside him, Mary sat in quiet contemplation, her gaze fixed out the window. "You've been quiet," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. Mary turned to him, her eyes soft but filled with concern. "I'm just thinking about everything," she said. "About you, about what you're getting into. I can't help but worry, Daniel." Daniel sighed, his grip loosening slightly on the wheel. "I have to do this, Mom. You know that." "I know," Mary replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Brian, he's not just any man. He's someone who's built his life on tearing others down. People like that don't stop just because you catch them." Daniel glanced at her briefly, before returning his focus to the road. "That's exactly why he has to be stopped. If we don't do this, he'll keep hurting people, and the system will keep letting him." Mary nodded slowly, but her expression remained clouded with worry. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "Promise me you'll be careful. I couldn't bear to see something happen to you." Daniel reached over, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "I promise, Mom. I'll be careful." The rest of the drive passed in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy between them. The following morning, Daniel arrived at his office to find a thick envelope waiting on his desk. The return address was unfamiliar, and a sense of unease crept over him as he opened it. Inside was a stack of photos, grainy, poorly lit, but unmistakable in their intent. They were surveillance photos of him and Mary, taken without their knowledge. One showed him entering the precinct. Another captured Mary leaving the grocery store. There was even one of them sitting in their living room, taken through the window. Daniel's stomach turned as he flipped through the images. At the bottom of the stack was a note, scrawled in uneven handwriting: "Drop it, Thompson, or the next photo will be the last." He clenched his fists, anger surging through him. This was a desperate move, and it reeked of Brian's involvement. Daniel's mind raced. Brian was suspended. How could he still be pulling strings like this? And who else was involved? Before he could dwell on it further, his phone buzzed. It was Alex. Detective Alex, Daniel answered, his voice tense. "Thompson, we've got a problem," Alex said, his tone matching Daniel's urgency. "One of our informants just went dark. He was supposed to deliver a key piece of evidence on Brian's network, records, names, the whole thing. We think someone got to him." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Do you think Brian's behind it?" Alex hesitated. "It's likely. He's got connections, even outside the department. But without that evidence, it's going to be a lot harder to build this case." Daniel glanced at the photos on his desk. "He's trying to scare us into backing off." "Are you scared?" Alex asked, a hint of a challenge in his voice. "No," Daniel said firmly, "but I am angry." "Good," Alex replied. "Use it. We'll need every bit of fight you've got if we're going to take him down." That evening, Daniel returned home to find Mary waiting for him in the kitchen. She was stirring a pot of soup, the familiar aroma filling the air, but her expression was distant. "I didn't hear you come in," she said softly as Daniel set his briefcase on the counter. "I didn't want to disturb you," Daniel replied, leaning against the counter. He hesitated before pulling the photos from his bag and laying them on the table. "Mom, we need to talk." Mary set down the ladle, her eyes narrowing as she approached the table. She picked up the photos, her hand trembling as she flipped through them. "They've been watching us," she said, her voice a mixture of fear and anger. "Who sent these?" Daniel hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but it's obvious who benefits from trying to intimidate us." Mary sat down heavily, her hand resting on the photos. "This is dangerous, Daniel. I don't care what the investigators say. You're up against more than just one man." "I know," Daniel said, his voice steady, "but if we let them scare us, they win. And I can't let that happen." Mary looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're so much like your father," she said softly, "always standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." Daniel smiled faintly. "I had a good example." For a moment, the tension eased, replaced by a quiet understanding between them. But it was short-lived. A loud knock at the door shattered the silence, sending a jolt through both of them. Daniel rose quickly, his body tense as he approached the door. "Who is it?" he called, his voice firm. "It's Alex," came the reply. "Open up." Daniel unlocked the door, letting the detective in. Alex stepped inside, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," Alex said, glancing at Mary before lowering his voice. "Carter's making moves. We intercepted a message suggesting he's planning something big. We don't have all the details yet, but it's clear he's not backing down." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "What do we do?" Alex hesitated, glancing at Mary again. "We need to move fast, but it's going to get messy, and I need to know you're ready for that." Daniel's gaze hardened. "I'm ready." Mary stood, her expression resolute. "Whatever you need to do, Daniel, you have my support. Just don't forget to take care of yourself." Daniel nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but he also knew he couldn't turn back. Brian had crossed too many lines, hurt too many people, and Daniel wasn't about to let him get away with it. As Alex outlined their next steps, Daniel felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight was far from over, but he was ready to see it through to the end. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Daniel stood at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. Across from him sat Brian Carter, no longer in uniform, but dressed in an ill-fitting suit. The arrogance that once defined his demeanor had faded, replaced by a twitchy nervousness as he glanced around the room. His attorney shuffled papers, trying to project calm, but even she seemed to sense the inevitable. Mary sat in the gallery behind Daniel, her presence a steadying force. She wore her best Sunday dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was composed, but her eyes carried the weight of years of injustice finally being addressed. The seats around her were filled with community members, activists, and reporters, all there to witness the culmination of a battle that had started with humiliation, but had grown into something far greater. The judge entered, and the bailiff's call to order echoed through the room. Everyone stood, then sat as the proceedings began. Daniel rose to deliver his final argument, the culmination of months of work and years of personal conviction. "Your Honor," Daniel began, his voice steady but impassioned, "this case isn't just about what happened to my mother, although her pain is at the heart of it. It's about a pattern, a systemic failure that allowed a man like Brian Carter to abuse his authority for years without consequence. This courtroom represents a chance to do what the system has failed to do, hold him accountable." He gestured toward the evidence displayed on a screen, the recordings, the witness testimonies, the documents unearthed during the investigation. Each piece painted a damning portrait of a man who had wielded his badge like a weapon against the very people he was supposed to protect. "For too long, people like my mother have lived in fear of men like him," Daniel continued, his voice rising. "But today, we have the power to send a message that no one is above the law and that justice is not just a word, it's an action." Brian's attorney stood to deliver a rebuttal, but her arguments felt hollow, her words failing to counter the mountain of evidence. Brian sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the judge and the jury. The man who once exuded control now looked like a cornered animal. When the jury returned, the foreperson's voice was clear, we find the defendant guilty. The words hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted. Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't celebrate. Instead, he turned to Mary, whose eyes glistened with tears. She reached for his hand, her grip strong. "You did it," she whispered. "No, Mom," Daniel said, his voice filled with emotion. "We did it." Brian was escorted out in handcuffs, his head bowed. The sentence was harsh but fair, prison time and the forfeiture of his pension. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring he could never harm anyone else. Weeks later, Daniel sat in his office, reviewing the final pieces of the larger investigation that had unfolded. Brian's trial had opened the floodgates, exposing a network of corruption that extended far beyond one man. Several officers had been suspended or dismissed, and systemic reforms were being implemented in the department. It was a start, but Daniel knew the fight for justice was ongoing. Mary entered the office, carrying a plate of cookies. "You've been working too hard," she said, setting them down. Daniel smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Mary sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "You've done something incredible, Daniel. Not just for me, but for this whole community. Your father would be so proud." Her words hit him deeply, and he nodded, his throat tightening. "I just want to make things better, Mom. For everyone. You have," Mary said firmly, "and you'll keep doing it." In the months that followed, Daniel became a prominent advocate for police reform, using his platform to push for accountability and change. His work inspired others to come forward, sharing their own stories of injustice. Mary, too, found herself at the center of a community movement, her quiet strength becoming a source of inspiration for many. As for Brian, his fall from grace was swift and absolute. The man who once wielded power so carelessly was now just another inmate, facing the consequences of his actions in a way he never expected. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder that abuse of power would not go unchecked. To everyone watching, this story isn't just about Daniel or Mary. It's about the strength it takes to stand up to injustice, even when the odds are stacked against you. It's about the importance of holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they may seem. And it's about the power of community. How, together, we can demand change and make it happen. So, what did this story mean to you? Did it make you think about the importance of standing up for what's right? Did it inspire you to question the systems around you and push for accountability? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful narratives like this one. Join us here on Tales of Twist, where we explore stories of justice, redemption, and the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next twist.